Away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The man was still sitting in his car, watching me leave. I never went back to that campsite again. The memory of that night stayed with me, a constant reminder of how vulnerable I was out there alone. Sometimes, the scariest things aren't the creatures or ghosts we imagine in the dark. Sometimes, it's the people who walk among us. A few weeks later, I was scrolling through the news on my phone and saw a headline that made my blood run cold. Hiker found dead in woods, police investigating. The article mentioned the same area where I had camped. The body was found near an abandoned campsite, and the victim had been missing for several days before being discovered. There were no signs of a struggle, and the cause of death was still unknown. The realization hit me hard. What if the man I saw in the parking lot had something to do with it? What if he was the same person who had unzipped my tent that night? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. The story haunted me, and I started to notice strange things happening around my house. Doors that I knew I had locked were found open, and items would be moved or go missing. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard footsteps outside my window. My heart pounded as I got up to look, but there was no one there. A few days later, I found a note taped to my front door. It was a single piece of paper with one word written in messy handwriting. Soon. I called the police, but there wasn't much they could do with so little evidence. They told me to be careful and to report any suspicious activity immediately. I installed security cameras and changed the locks on my doors, but the feeling of being watched never went away. Every night, I lay in bed, listening for the sound of footsteps, waiting for the next note or sign that the man from the woods hadn't forgotten about me. The fear that had started in those dark woods now followed me everywhere, a shadow that never left, a constant reminder that sometimes, the scariest monsters are real. I decided to go camping alone in the woods for the first time. I needed a break from city life, and spending a night under the stars sounded perfect. I found a spot near a small, calm lake, surrounded by thick trees. It was quiet and peaceful. After setting up my tent, I gathered some wood and started a campfire. The crackling fire was comforting as the sun began to set. The sky turned shades of orange and pink, reflecting beautifully off the water. I cooked a simple meal and enjoyed the quiet. Everything felt perfect. As darkness fell, I heard the sounds of the forest coming alive. The hooting of an owl, the rustling of leaves, and the distant croak of frogs filled the night. I felt a bit uneasy but told myself it was just the normal sounds of the woods. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, until I felt tired. I put out the fire, zipped up my tent, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The night was cooler than I expected, and the only light came from the moon shining through the trees. I woke up to a strange noise outside my tent. It was a low, growling sound, unlike anything I had ever heard. My heart raced. I lay still, listening closely. The noise continued, getting closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot. Something big was moving outside. I quietly reached for my flashlight and my camping knife. My hand shook as I turned on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything unusual. The sound stopped. I strained my ears, trying to hear any movement, but there was only silence. After what felt like forever, I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The night was still and quiet again. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. I decided it was probably an animal, and that I was overreacting. I closed the tent and lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound seemed louder, keeping me on edge. Eventually, I got so tired that I fell into a restless sleep. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was streaming into the tent. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside carefully. The area around my campsite looked undisturbed, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling from the night before. I packed up my gear, ready to leave the woods. As I was folding my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were large footprints in the dirt, much larger than any human or common animal. They led away from my campsite and into the deeper parts of the forest. I decided not to stick around to investigate further. I finished packing and hiked back to my car as quickly as possible. The whole way back, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. When I finally reached my car and locked the doors, a wave of relief washed over me. I drove away from the woods, vowing to never camp alone again. The peace and quiet I had wanted turned into a night I would never forget, a reminder of how small we are in the wild. I made it home safely, but the memory of that night stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever made those footprints was still out there, watching. From then on, I always made sure to camp with friends, never alone. Nature is beautiful, but it has its own rules and dangers. Sometimes, when I lie in bed at night, I can still hear those footsteps crunching in the leaves. I wonder if it followed me home, waiting for the right moment to remind me that out there, in the dark, I'm never truly alone. I decided to go camping alone in a remote forest I'd never been to before. The trees were thick, and it was so quiet, except for rustling in the bushes now and then. As the sun went down, I made a small fire and pitched my tent in a clearing. Night came fast, and soon, all I could hear was the fire crackling and an owl hooting in the distance. As I got into my sleeping bag, a weird feeling washed over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept looking into the darkness beyond the fire's glow. Hours passed, and just as I was starting to drift off, I heard footsteps coming from the trees. My heart raced as I sat up, trying to see through the dark. A figure appeared slowly, outlined against the faint moonlight. It was a man, dirty and messy, staring right at me with intense eyes. He didn't say a word, just stood there, not moving. Fear gripped me as I fumbled for something to protect myself. The man took a step closer, and I saw something shiny in his hand. Without thinking, I grabbed a burning stick from the fire and held it up. "Stay back!" I yelled, my voice shaking. The man hesitated, then turned and melted back into the shadows of the forest. I sat there, trembling, until the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. I quickly packed up and hurried out of the forest. Every snap of a twig behind me made my heart pound harder. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, still scared. Looking back at the forest, I knew I had narrowly escaped something bad. The encounter haunted me for weeks, making me scared to camp alone again. It was a scary reminder of how vulnerable we are in the wild, where danger can hide just beyond the fire's light. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the woods was still out there, watching, waiting for another chance. I woke up to the sound of leaves crunching outside my tent. It was pitch dark, and I groped around for my flashlight. When I finally found it and turned it on, I saw two glowing eyes staring at me from the edge of the campsite. My heart raced, and I grabbed my small knife, slowly unzipping the tent flap. Outside, a big wolf stood, its fur standing on end in the cold night air. I stepped back cautiously, trying to stay calm. The wolf didn't move, just stared at me with those piercing eyes. I knew I had to scare it away somehow. I grabbed some rocks and hurled them towards the wolf, shouting as loudly as I could. The wolf paused for a moment, then turned and melted into the darkness. I breathed a sigh of relief, but my nerves were still on edge. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening intently for any other sounds. At dawn, I hastily packed up, eager to leave the eerie silence behind. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced back towards the campsite one last time, and there, standing at the edge of the trees, was the wolf again. It didn't move, just watched me depart. I drove away, relieved to be safe. But in the following weeks, I couldn't shake the memory of those glowing eyes in the darkness. I wondered if the wolf was merely curious or if there was something more sinister lurking out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity. It was supposed to be a chill weekend away from the city madness. I decided to go camping solo, something I'd done a few times hassle-free. I found a spot by a quiet lake deep in the woods. The view was perfect: tall trees, clear water, and a sky so clear I could see the Milky Way at night. The first night passed smoothly. I sat by the fire, listening to the crackling wood and the sounds of nature around me. The next day, I hiked and fished. As evening crept in, I set up my small campfire again, cooked dinner, and settled in. Just after sunset, I heard rustling in the bushes nearby. Probably a raccoon or deer, I thought. Didn't bother me much. As it got darker, the rustling grew louder and more frequent. Unease crept in. I aimed my flashlight towards the noise but saw nothing. Convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks and went to bed. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night. Something felt off. The forest was dead silent. No crickets, no owls, just eerie silence. Then I heard it again, the rustling, right outside my tent. Heart racing, I lay still, trying to figure out what it could be. Decided to check it out. Quietly unzipped my tent, stepped out with flashlight in hand, and pointed it towards the bushes. Again, nothing. Took a few steps away, scanning the area. Snap! A branch behind me broke. Whipped around. In the dim light, I saw a man. Dirty, clothes torn, wild eyes. We stared. Didn't say a word. Slowly back towards my tent, eyes fixed on him. He stayed put. Reached my tent, grabbed my pack, and bolted. Ran through the woods, stumbling over roots and branches, not caring about noise. Just needed to flee. Reached my car, breathless, shaking. Fumbled for keys, started the engine, and sped off. Didn't stop till the nearest town. Pulled into a gas station, locked doors, and sat there, trying to calm down. Next day, it sank in how lucky I'd been. Never knew what that guy wanted. Reported it to authorities. They promised to look into it, but heard nothing more. Changed me. Love nature but cautious now. No more solo camping. Always let someone know where I am. That weekend reminded me, nature's beautiful but can also be unpredictable, dangerous. As I drove away, a chill ran down my spine. What if he wasn't alone out there? I've always loved hiking, especially exploring new trails. One summer afternoon, I decided to try a new path up in the mountains. The sky was clear, and I was ready for a good workout. At first, the trail was easy with wide paths and clear signs. But as I climbed higher, the path became narrower and rockier. The trees grew thicker, and I noticed fewer hikers around. I thought maybe everyone else was at the popular spots. After about an hour, I came to a fork in the path. My phone map wasn't clear, but I trusted my gut and chose the left path. It was steeper than I expected, but I liked the challenge. Soon I realized it wasn't just steep, it was dangerous. Loose rocks made every step tricky, and the trail was almost hidden by thick bushes. Then I heard it, a rustling in the bushes ahead. I froze, my heart pounding. Maybe it was just a small animal, I told myself. But the rustling grew louder and closer. My breathing sped up. I grabbed a thick branch for protection, feeling a bit silly but needing the comfort. Slowly, I moved forward. The rustling stopped. I waited, looking around, but saw nothing. Feeling a bit better, I kept going, though my nerves were on edge. After a while, I realized the trail had completely disappeared, and I was lost. Panic set in. The sun was starting to set, and the shadows grew longer, making everything look eerie. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked different in the fading light. I cursed myself for not bringing a compass or paying better attention to my route. As darkness fell, I found a small clearing and decided to stay there for the night. I gathered some dried branches and managed to start a small fire. The flickering flames provided some comfort, but every crackle in the woods made me jump. I barely slept, waking at every sound. The night seemed endless, but finally dawn broke. With the first light, I felt a renewed determination to find my way back. I decided to head downhill, thinking it would eventually lead me to a main path or a stream. After what felt like hours of struggling and sliding down the rocky slope, I stumbled upon a wide, well-worn trail. Relief washed over me. Following the path, I soon saw familiar landmarks from the hike up. I quickened my pace, eager to leave the dense forest behind. As I descended, I encountered a group of hikers. They looked surprised to see me coming from the direction I did. I told them briefly about my ordeal, and they offered water and snacks, which I gratefully accepted. When I finally reached the trailhead, I sat on a bench, exhausted but safe. That day taught me a valuable lesson about preparation and respect for nature's unpredictability. I knew I'd be back on the trails soon, but next time, I'd be better equipped and more cautious. As I drove home, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. The rustling sound from the bushes haunted me. Weeks later, while cleaning out my hiking gear, I found a small, muddy footprint on my backpack. It was much smaller than my own. I knew I hadn't been alone in those woods, and the thought still gives me chills. We got to the campsite just before it got dark. The drive was long, and I was glad to get out of the car and set up my tent. The air was cool, and the forest around us was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves. It felt nice to be away from the city noise, surrounded by trees. After setting up camp, we gathered around the fire to make dinner. The fire's warmth felt good as it got colder. The sky turned dark, and stars started to appear above. We talked and laughed, sharing stories and enjoying the quiet. Later, as the fire died down, we decided to go to bed. I crawled into my tent and got into my sleeping bag. The sounds of the forest were calming, and I quickly fell asleep. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. Something didn't feel right. I stayed still, listening. There was a strange sound outside, like footsteps, but heavier. My heart started to beat faster. I told myself it was probably an animal, but I felt uneasy. I stayed very still, hoping whatever it was would go away. The footsteps got louder and closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves and the snap of twigs. My mind raced with thoughts: a bear, a deer, maybe even another person. I didn't know which was worse. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath, my body stiff with fear. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. Then, slowly, the zipper of my tent started to move. Panic set in, and I grabbed the small knife I kept by my side. The tent flap opened, and I could see a dark shape against the dim moonlight. Before I could think, the shape lunged at me, and I slashed with the knife. There was a grunt of pain, and the shape pulled back. I scrambled out of the tent, my heart racing. Outside, I could see the shape better. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes, holding his side where I had cut him. He looked at me with wild eyes. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I turned and ran as fast as I could into the forest, the darkness swallowing me. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. Eventually, I found a small clearing and collapsed to the ground, trying to catch my breath. I could still hear the sounds of the forest, but the footsteps were gone. When the sun came up, I made my way back to the campsite, carefully. The man was gone, but my tent was torn apart, my stuff scattered everywhere. I quickly packed up what I could and left, my mind spinning from the night's events. As I drove away, the reality of what happened hit me. I had come face to face with something scarier than any ghost or monster, another human being with unknown intentions. The experience left me shaken, and the forest, once a place of peace, now held a much darker memory for me. I never went camping again after that. Every night, I lie awake, remembering the sound of that zipper slowly moving. Sometimes, I think I hear those heavy footsteps outside my window. I'll never know what that man wanted, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes.